Chapter 28. A June Evening. "I wonder what it would be like to live in a world where it was always June," said Anne, as she came through the spice and bloom of the twilit orchard to the front door steps, where Marilla and Mrs. Rachel were sitting, talking over Mrs. Sampson Coates' funeral, which they had attended that day. Dora sat between them, diligently studying her lessons, but Davy was sitting tailor fashion on the grass, looking as gloomy and depressed as his single dimple would let him.
"You'd get tired of it,"
said Marilla with a sigh. "I dare say, but just now I feel that it would take me a long time to get tired of it, if it were all as charming as today. Everything loves June. Davy boy, why this melancholy November face in blossom time?"
"I'm just sick and tired of living,"
said the youthful pessimist. "At 10 years? Dear me, how sad!"
"I'm not making fun,"
said Davy with dignity.
"I'm discouraged,"
bringing out the big word with a valiant effort. "Why and wherefore?" asked Anne, sitting down beside him.
"'Cause the new teacher that come when Mr. Holmes got sick give me 10 sums to do for Monday. It'll take me all day tomorrow to do them. It isn't fair to have to work Saturdays. Milty Boulter said he wouldn't do them, but Marilla says I've got to. I don't like Miss Carson a bit."
"Don't talk like that about your teacher, Davy Keith,"
said Mrs. Rachel severely.
"Miss Carson is a very fine girl. There is no nonsense about her."
"That doesn't sound very attractive," laughed Anne. "I like people to have a little nonsense about them. But I'm inclined to have a better opinion of Miss Carson than you have. I saw her in prayer meeting last night, and she has a pair of eyes that can't always look sensible. Now, Davy boy, take heart of grace. Tomorrow will bring another day, and I'll help you with the sums as far as in me lies. Don't waste this lovely hour twixt light and dark worrying over arithmetic."
"Well, I won't,"
said Davy, brightening up.
"If you'll help me with the sums, I'll have 'em done in time to go fishing with Milty. I wish old Aunt Atossa's funeral was tomorrow instead of today. I wanted to go to it 'cause Milty said his mother said Aunt Atossa would be sure to rise up in her coffin and say sarcastic things to the folks that come to see her buried. But Marilla said she didn't."
"Poor Atossa laid in her coffin peaceful enough,"
said Mrs. Lynde solemnly.
"I never saw her look so pleasant before, that's what. Well, there weren't many tears shed over her, poor old soul. The Elisha Wrights are thankful to be rid of her, and I can't say I blame them a mite."
"It seems to me a most dreadful thing to go out of the world and not leave one person behind you who is sorry you are gone," said Anne, shuddering.
"Nobody except her parents ever loved poor Atossa. That's certain, not even her husband,"
averred Mrs. Lynde.
"She was his fourth wife. He'd sort of got into the habit of marrying. He only lived a few years after he married her. The doctor said he died of dyspepsia, but I shall always maintain that he died of Atossa's tongue. That's what. Poor soul. She always knew everything about her neighbors, but she never was very well acquainted with herself. Well, she's gone anyhow, and I suppose the next excitement will be Diana's wedding."
"It seems funny and horrible to think of Diana's being married," sighed Anne, hugging her knees and looking through the gap in the haunted wood to the light that was shining in Diana's room.
"I don't see what's horrible about it, when she's doing so well,"
said Mrs. Lynde emphatically.
"Fred Wright has a fine farm, and he is a model young man."
"He certainly isn't the wild, dashing, wicked young man Diana once wanted to marry," smiled Anne. "Fred is extremely good."
"That's just what he ought to be. Do you want Diana to marry a wicked man? Or marry one yourself?"
"Oh, no. I wouldn't want to marry anybody who was wicked, but I think I'd like it if he could be wicked and wouldn't. Now Fred is hopelessly good."
"You'll have more sense some day, I hope,"
said Marilla. Marilla spoke rather bitterly. She was grievously disappointed. She knew Anne had refused Gilbert Blythe. Avonlea gossip buzzed over the fact, which had leaked out, nobody knew how. Perhaps Charlie Sloane had guessed and told his guesses for truth. Perhaps Diana had betrayed it to Fred, and Fred had been indiscreet. At all events, it was known. Mrs. Blythe no longer asked Anne, in public or private, if she had heard lately from Gilbert, but passed her by with a frosty bow. Anne, who had always liked Gilbert's merry, young-hearted mother, was grieved in secret over this. Marilla said nothing, but Mrs. Lynde gave Anne many exasperated digs about it, until fresh gossip reached that worthy lady, through the medium of Moody Spurgeon Macpherson's mother, that Anne had another beau at college, who was rich and handsome and good all in one. After that Mrs. Rachel held her tongue, though she still wished in her inmost heart that Anne had accepted Gilbert. Riches were all very well, but even Mrs. Rachel, practical soul though she was, did not consider them the one essential. If Anne liked the handsome unknown better than Gilbert, there was nothing more to be said. But Mrs. Rachel was dreadfully afraid that Anne was going to make the mistake of marrying for money. Marilla knew Anne too well to fear this, but she felt that something in the universal scheme of things had gone sadly awry.
"What is to be will be,"
said Mrs. Rachel gloomily.
"and what isn't to be happens sometimes. I can't help believing it's going to happen in Anne's case. If Providence doesn't interfere, that's what."
Mrs. Rachel sighed. She was afraid Providence wouldn't interfere, and she didn't dare to. Anne had wandered down to the Dryad's Bubble, and was curled up among the ferns at the root of the big white birch, where she and Gilbert had so often sat in summers gone by. He had gone into the newspaper office again when college closed, and Avonlea seemed very dull without him. He never wrote to her, and Anne missed the letters that never came. To be sure, Roy wrote twice a week. His letters were exquisite compositions, which would have read beautifully in a memoir or biography. Anne felt herself more deeply in love with him than ever when she read them, but her heart never gave the queer, quick, painful bound at sight of his letters which it had given one day when Mrs. Hiram Sloane had handed her out an envelope addressed in Gilbert's black, upright handwriting. Anne had hurried home to the east gable and opened it eagerly, to find a typewritten copy of some college society report, only that and nothing more. Anne flung the harmless screed across her room and sat down to write an especially nice epistle to Roy. Diana was to be married in 5 more days. The gray house at Orchard Slope was in a turmoil of baking and brewing and boiling and stewing, for there was to be a big old-timey wedding. Anne, of course, was to be bridesmaid, as had been arranged when they were 12 years old, and Gilbert was coming from Kingsport to be best man. Anne was enjoying the excitement of the various preparations, but under it all she carried a little heartache. She was, in a sense, losing her dear old chum. Diana's new home would be 2 miles from Green Gables, and the old constant companionship could never be theirs again. Anne looked up at Diana's light, and thought how it had beaconed to her for many years, but soon it would shine through the summer twilights no more. 2 big painful tears welled up in her gray eyes. "Oh," she thought, "how horrible it is that people have to grow up, and marry, and change." End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29. Diana's Wedding. "After all, the only real roses are the pink ones," said Anne, as she tied white ribbon around Diana's bouquet in the westward-looking gable at Orchard Slope. "They are the flowers of love and faith." Diana was standing nervously in the middle of the room, arrayed in her bridal white, her black curls frosted over with the film of her wedding veil. Anne had draped that veil, in accordance with the sentimental compact of years before. "It's all pretty much as I used to imagine it long ago, when I wept over your inevitable marriage and our consequent parting," she laughed. "You are the bride of my dreams, Diana, with the lovely misty veil, and I am your bridesmaid. But alas, I haven't the puffed sleeves, though these short lace ones are even prettier. Neither is my heart wholly breaking, nor do I exactly hate Fred."
"We're not really parting, Anne,"
protested Diana.
"I'm not going far away. We'll love each other just as much as ever. We've always kept that oath of friendship we swore long ago, haven't we?"
"Yes, we've kept it faithfully. We've had a beautiful friendship, Diana. We've never marred it by one quarrel or coolness or unkind word, and I hope it will always be so. But things can't be quite the same after this. You'll have other interests. I'll just be on the outside. But such is life, as Mrs. Rachel says. Mrs. Rachel has given you one of her beloved knitted quilts of the tobacco stripe pattern, and she says when I am married she'll give me one too."
"The mean thing about your getting married is that I won't be able to be your bridesmaid,"
lamented Diana. I'm to be Phil's bridesmaid next June when she marries Mr. Blake, and then I must stop, for you know the proverb, 3 times a bridesmaid, never a bride," said Anne, peeping through the window over the pink and snow of the blossoming orchard beneath. "Here comes the minister, Diana,"
Oh, Anne!
gasped Diana, suddenly turning very pale and beginning to tremble.
Oh, Anne, I'm so nervous. I can't go through with it. Anne, I know I'm going to faint.
"If you do, I'll drag you down to the rainwater hogshead and drop you in," said Anne unsympathetically. "Cheer up, dearest. Getting married can't be so very terrible when so many people survive the ceremony. See how cool and composed I am, and take courage."
Wait till your turn comes, Miss Anne. Oh, Anne, I hear Father coming upstairs. Give me my bouquet. Is my veil right? Am I very pale?
"You look just lovely. Di, darling, kiss me goodbye for the last time. Diana Barry will never kiss me again."
Diana Wright will, though. There, Mother's calling. Come.
Following the simple, old-fashioned way in vogue then, Anne went down to the parlour on Gilbert's arm. They met at the top of the stairs for the first time since they had left Kingsport, for Gilbert had arrived only that day. Gilbert shook hands courteously. He was looking very well, though, as Anne instantly noted, rather thin. He was not pale. There was a flush on his cheek that had burned into it as Anne came along the hall towards him, in her soft white dress, with lilies of the valley in the shining masses of her hair. As they entered the crowded parlour together, a little murmur of admiration ran around the room.
"What a fine-looking pair they make,"
whispered the impressible Mrs. Rachel to Marilla. Fred ambled in alone, with a very red face, and then Diana swept in on her father's arm. She did not faint, and nothing untoward occurred to interrupt the ceremony. Feasting and merrymaking followed. Then, as the evening waned, Fred and Diana drove away through the moonlight to their new home, and Gilbert walked with Anne to Green Gables. Something of their old comradeship had returned during the informal mirth of the evening. Oh, it was nice to be walking over that well-known road with Gilbert again. The night was so very still that one should have been able to hear the whisper of roses in blossom, the laughter of daisies, the piping of grasses, many sweet sounds all tangled up together. The beauty of moonlight on familiar fields irradiated the world.
"Can't we take a ramble up Lover's Lane before you go in?"
asked Gilbert, as they crossed the bridge over the Lake of Shining Waters, in which the moon lay like a great drowned blossom of gold. Anne assented readily. Lover's Lane was a veritable path in a fairyland that night, a shimmering, mysterious place, full of wizardry in the white-woven enchantment of moonlight. There had been a time when such a walk with Gilbert through Lover's Lane would have been far too dangerous. But Roy and Christine had made it very safe now. Anne found herself thinking a good deal about Christine as she chatted lightly to Gilbert. She had met her several times before leaving Kingsport, and had been charmingly sweet to her. Christine had also been charmingly sweet. Indeed, they were a most cordial pair. But for all that, their acquaintance had not ripened into friendship. Evidently Christine was not a kindred spirit.
"Are you going to be in Avonlea all summer?"
asked Gilbert. "No, I'm going down east to Valley Road next week. Esther Haythorne wants me to teach for her through July and August. They have a summer term in that school, and Esther isn't feeling well, so I'm going to substitute for her. In one way I don't mind. Do you know, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like a stranger in Avonlea now. It makes me sorry, but it's true. It's quite appalling to see the number of children who have shot up into big boys and girls, really young men and women, these past 2 years. Half of my pupils are grown up. It makes me feel awfully old to see them in the places you and I and our mates used to fill." Anne laughed and sighed. She felt very old and mature and wise, which showed how young she was. She told herself that she longed greatly to go back to those dear merry days when life was seen through a rosy mist of hope and illusion, and possessed an indefinable something that had passed away forever. Where was it now, the glory and the dream?
"So wags the world away,"
quoted Gilbert practically and a trifle absently. Anne wondered if he were thinking of Christine. Oh, Avonlea was going to be so lonely now, with Diana gone. End of chapter 29. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 30. Mrs. Skinner's Romance. Anne stepped off the train at Valley Road Station and looked about to see if anyone had come to meet her. She was to board with a certain Miss Janet Sweet, but she saw no one who answered in the least to her preconception of that lady, as formed from Esther's letter. The only person in sight was an elderly woman, sitting in a wagon with mail-bags piled around her. 200 would have been a charitable guess at her weight. Her face was as round and red as a harvest moon, and almost as featureless. She wore a tight, black cashmere dress, made in the fashion of 10 years ago, a little dusty black straw hat trimmed with bows of yellow ribbon, and faded black lace mitts.
"Here, you!"
she called, waving her whip at Anne.
"Are you the new Valley Road school, ma'am?"
"Yes."
"Well, I thought so. Valley Road is noted for its good-looking schoolma'ams, just as Millersville is noted for its homely ones. Janet Sweet asked me this morning if I could bring you out. I said, 'Certain I can, if she don't mind being scrunched up some. This rig of mine's kind of small for the mail bags, and I'm some heftier than Thomas. Just wait, miss, till I shift these bags a bit, and I'll tuck you in somehow. It's only 2 miles to Janet's. Her next-door neighbor's hired boy is coming for your trunk tonight. My name is Skinner, Amelia Skinner.'"
Anne was eventually tucked in, exchanging amused smiles with herself during the process.
"Jog along, black mare,"
commanded Mrs. Skinner, gathering up the reins in her pudgy hands.
"This is my first trip on the mail route. Thomas wanted to hoe his turnips today, so he asked me to come. So I just sat down and took a standing-up snack and started. I sorter like it. O' course it's rather tedious. Part of the time I sits and thinks, and the rest I just sits. Jog along, black mare. I want to git home early. Thomas is terrible lonesome when I'm away. You see, we haven't been married very long."
"Oh," said Anne politely.
"Just a month. Thomas courted me for quite a spell, though. It was real romantic."
Anne tried to picture Mrs. Skinner on speaking terms with romance, and failed. "Oh," she said again.
"Yes, you see, there was another man after me. Jog along, black mare. I'd been a widow so long, folks had given up expecting me to marry again. But when my daughter, she's a schoolma'am like you, went out west to teach, I felt real lonesome, and wasn't nowise set against the idea. By, Thomas began to come up, and so did the other feller, William Obadiah Seaman, his name was. For a long time I couldn't make up my mind which of them to take, and they kep' a-comin' and comin', and I kep' a-worrying. You see, W.O. was rich, he had a fine place, and carried considerable style. He was by far the best match. Jog along, black mare."
"Why didn't you marry him?" asked Anne.
"Well, you see, he didn't love me,"
answered Mrs. Skinner solemnly. Anne opened her eyes widely and looked at Mrs. Skinner, but there was not a glint of humor on that lady's face. Evidently Mrs. Skinner saw nothing amusing in her own case.
"He'd been a widow man for 3 years, and his sister kept house for him. Then she got married, and he just wanted someone to look after his house. It was worth looking after, too, mind you that. It's a handsome house. Jog along, black mare. As for Thomas, he was poor, and if his house didn't leak in dry weather, it was about all that could be said for it, though it looks kind of picturesque. But you see, I loved Thomas, and I didn't care 1 red cent for W.O. So I argued it out with myself. 'Sarah Crowe,' say I, my first was a crow, 'you can marry your rich man if you like, but you won't be happy. Folks can't get along together in this world without a little bit of love. You'd just better tie up to Thomas, for he loves you and you love him, and nothing else ain't going to do you. Jog along, black mare.' So I told Thomas I'd take him. All the time I was getting ready, I never dared to drive past W.O.'s place for fear the sight of that fine house of his would put me in the swithers again. But now I never think of it at all, and I'm just that comfortable and happy with Thomas. Jog along, black mare."
How did William Obadiah take it? Queried Anne.
Oh, he rampest a bit, but he's going to see a skinny old maid in Millersville now, and I guess she'll take him fast enough. She'll make him a better wife than his first did. W.O. never wanted to marry her. He just asked her to marry him 'cause his father wanted him to, never dreaming but that she'd say no. But, mind you, she said yes. There was a predicament for you. Jog along, Black Mare. She was a great housekeeper, but most awful mean. She wore the same bonnet for 18 years. Then she got a new one, and W.O. met her on the road and didn't know her. Jog along, Black Mare. I feel that I'd a narrow escape. I might have married him and been most awful miserable, like my poor cousin Jane Ann. Jane Ann married a rich man she didn't care anything about, and she hasn't the life of a dog. She come to see me last week and says she, 'Sarah Skinner, I envy you. I'd rather live in a little hut on the side of the road with a man I was fond of than in my big house with the one I've got. Jane Ann's man ain't such a bad sort neither, though he's so contrary that he wears his fur coat when the thermometer's at 90. The only way to get him to do anything is to coax him to do the opposite. But there ain't any love to smooth things down, and it's a poor way of living. Jog along, Black Mare. There's Janet's place in the hollow. Wayside, she calls it. Quite picturesque, ain't it? I guess you'll be glad to get out of this, with all them mail bags jamming round you.
Yes, but I have enjoyed my drive with you very much, said Anne sincerely.
Get away now,
said Mrs. Skinner, highly flattered.
Wait till I tell Thomas that. He always feels dreadful tickled when I get a compliment. Jog along, Black Mare. Well, here we are. I hope you'll get on well in the school, miss. There's a short cut to it, through the marsh back of Janet's. If you take that way, be awful careful. If you once got stuck in that black mud, you'd be sucked right down and never seen or heard tell of again till the day of judgment, like Adam Palmer's cow. Jog along, Black Mare.
End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31. Anne to Philippa. Anne Shirley to Philippa Gordon, greeting. Well, beloved, it's high time I was writing you. Here I am, installed once more as a country schoolma'am at Valley Road, boarding at Wayside, the home of Miss Janet Sweet. Janet is a dear soul and very nice-looking. Tall, but not over-tall. Stoutish, yet with a certain restraint of outline, suggestive of a thrifty soul who is not going to be over-lavish even in the matter of avoirdupois. She has a knot of soft, crimpy brown hair with a thread of grey in it, a sunny face with rosy cheeks, and big, kind eyes as blue as forget-me-nots. Moreover, she is one of those delightful, old-fashioned cooks who don't care a bit if they ruin your digestion, as long as they can give you feasts of fat things. I like her, and she likes me. Principally, it seems, because she had a sister named Anne who died young. "I'm real glad to see you," she said briskly, when I landed in her yard. "My, you don't look a mite like I expected. I was sure you'd be dark. My sister Anne was dark. And here you're red-headed." For a few minutes I thought I wasn't going to like Janet as much as I had expected at first sight. Then I reminded myself that I really must be more sensible than to be prejudiced against anyone simply because she called my hair red. Probably the word auburn was not in Janet's vocabulary at all. Wayside is a dear sort of little spot. The house is small and white, set down in a delightful little hollow that drops away from the road. Between road and house is an orchard and flower garden all mixed up together. The front door walk is bordered with quahog clamshells. Cowhawks, Janet calls them. There is Virginia creeper over the porch and moss on the roof. My room is a neat little spot off the parlor, just big enough for the bed and me. Over the head of my bed there is a picture of Robbie Burns standing at Highland Mary's grave, shadowed by an enormous weeping willow tree. Robbie's face is so lugubrious that it is no wonder I have bad dreams. Why, the first night I was here I dreamed I couldn't laugh. The parlor is tiny and neat. Its one window is so shaded by a huge willow that the room has a grotto-like effect of emerald gloom. There are wonderful tidies on the chairs, and gay mats on the floor, and books and cards carefully arranged on a round table, and vases of dried grass on the mantelpiece. Between the vases is a cheerful decoration of preserved coffin plates, 5 in all, pertaining respectively to Janet's father and mother, a brother, her sister Anne, and a hired man who died here once. If I go suddenly insane some of these days, know all men by these presents that those coffin plates have caused it. But it's all delightful, and I said so. Janet loved me for it, just as she detested poor Esther, because Esther had said so much shade was unhygienic and had objected to sleeping on a feather bed. Now, I glory in feather beds, and the more unhygienic and feathery they are, the more I glory. Janet says it is such a comfort to see me eat. She had been so afraid I would be like Miss Haythorn, who wouldn't eat anything but fruit and hot water for breakfast, and tried to make Janet give up frying things. Esther is really a dear girl, but she is rather given to fads. The trouble is that she hasn't enough imagination, and has a tendency to indigestion. Janet told me I could have the use of the parlour when any young men called. I don't think there are many to call. I haven't seen a young man in Valley Road yet, except the next-door hired boy, Sam Tolliver, a very tall, lank, tow-haired youth. He came over one evening recently, and sat for an hour on the garden fence, near the front porch, where Janet and I were doing fancy work. The only remarks he volunteered in all that time were, "Have a peppermint, miss? Do now. Fine thing for catarrh, peppermints." And, "Powerful lot of jump grasses round here ternight. Yep." But there is a love affair going on here. It seems to be my fortune to be mixed up, more or less actively, with elderly love affairs. Mr. and Mrs. Irving always say that I brought about their marriage. Mrs. Stephen Clark, of Carmody, persists in being most grateful to me for a suggestion which somebody else would probably have made if I hadn't. I do really think, though, that Ludovic Speed would never have got any further along than placid courtship if I had not helped him and Theodora Dix out. In the present affair I am only a passive spectator. I've tried once to help things along and made an awful mess of it, so I shall not meddle again. I'll tell you all about it when we meet. End of chapter 31.